A soft hum filled the Johnsons' quiet suburban home as the living room TV flickered with the evening news. 12-year-old Lily Johnson lay curled up on the couch, her eyes growing heavy. Her little brother, Danny, sat beside her, idly playing with his toy soldiers while their father, Mark, flipped through the channels. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and all was peaceful. Until the screaming started. Lily's eyes snapped open. At first, she thought it was the television, but the noise came from outside, high-pitched, terrified shrieks followed by deep, guttural growls. Mark frowned, muting the TV. He glanced at his wife, Sarah, who had just walked in from the kitchen. "What the hell was that?" she murmured. Mark moved to the window and peered through the blinds. A chill ran down his spine. A man staggered into the street, clutching his throat, blood spilling down his shirt. Behind him, a dark figure lunged forward and sank its teeth into his shoulder. A woman across the street let out a shriek, clutching her baby to her chest as another hunched-over shape crawled toward her. Mark's heart pounded. Jesus Christ! A deafening crash shattered the eerie moment. The Smiths' front door, 2 houses down, burst open, and a bloodied figure came stumbling out. It was Mr. Smith, the kind old man who had lived there for 20 years. He staggered forward, clawing at his own face, his eyes rolling back in his head. Then, his body convulsed, and he sprinted toward a nearby teenager. "Get away from the window," Mark barked. He grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling as he tried to dial 911. No service. A scream erupted from next door. The Hendersons. Sarah rushed to grab Danny, who had started crying, while Lily backed away from the window, her hands shaking. The world outside had turned into a nightmare. Figures moved erratically in the dark, some crawling on all fours, others sprinting with unnatural speed. A few still wore remnants of normal life, business suits, pajamas, even a wedding dress, now stained with blood. Mark locked the doors and ran to the back, double-checking the windows. "Turn off all the lights," he whispered. Sarah obeyed, but the second the room went dark, Lily could hear the noises more clearly. The gnashing of teeth. The wet, tearing sound of flesh being ripped from bone. The guttural moans of the things that used to be their neighbors. Then, footsteps on the porch. Danny whimpered, burying his face in Sarah's shoulder. Mark grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the stairs, his knuckles white as he motioned for them to stay silent. A low growl came from the other side of the door. Lily held her breath. The doorknob rattled. Then, bang! Something heavy slammed against the door. Again. And again. Sarah pressed a hand to Danny's mouth, muffling his terrified sobs. Mark held the bat tight, ready to swing the second the door gave way. Then, silence. Minutes crawled by. No one moved. Finally, Mark crept toward the peephole. What he saw nearly made him drop the bat. A woman stood on the porch, her body twitching violently. Her mouth hung open wider than should have been humanly possible, her jaw cracked and dislocated. Her eyes, milky white, void of anything human, darted frantically. Blood dripped from her fingers. And then, she sniffed the air. Mark's breath caught in his throat. She could smell them. A low, inhuman screech erupted from her throat as she flung herself against the door, her fingers clawing wildly. Lily bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. Then, in the distance, more screams. More of them were coming. A loud crash echoed from next door, followed by another round of panicked shrieks. The Hendersons. The monsters had gotten inside. Mark backed away from the door. "We can't stay here." Sarah looked at him in terror. "Where do we go?" He glanced at his children, at their wide, terrified eyes. Then at the things outside, sniffing them out like animals. "We run," he whispered. The house next door fell silent. And then, something sniffed outside their window. Mark tightened his grip on the baseball bat, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The unnatural sniffing outside the window made his skin crawl. The creature, no, the thing, was searching for them. Its ragged breaths sounded too close, as if it could smell the fear inside the house. Sarah held Danny tightly, her hand still pressed over his mouth. His little body trembled, his tears soaking into her shirt. Lily crouched beside them, her arms wrapped around her knees, barely breathing. Then, a loud thud against the glass. Lily flinched. The creature had slammed its face against the window, its distorted jaw twitching. A slow, deliberate snarl left its cracked lips, leaving streaks of blood as it exhaled onto the glass. Mark moved first. He motioned toward the stairs, keeping his steps silent. He didn't know where they could go, but they couldn't stay here. The front door rattled again, more of them were gathering. They needed to move. Now. Sarah nudged Danny, whispering in his ear, "Quiet, baby. We're going upstairs." The family moved as one, creeping up the stairs, staying close to the wall. Mark took the lead, stepping lightly. Every creak in the old wood made his stomach clench. Below, the sniffing turned into guttural snarls. A sudden bang rattled the front door. Mark froze mid-step. Then, crack! The sound of splintering wood. His stomach twisted. They were breaking in. Danny let out a tiny, muffled whimper, but Sarah hushed him just in time. Mark signaled toward their bedroom at the end of the hall. It had a lock. Maybe it would buy them time. They slipped inside, shutting the door just as the front door downstairs gave way with a deafening crash. The creatures were inside. Sarah pressed Danny against her, rocking him gently as silent tears streamed down his cheeks. Lily was shaking, gripping her mother's arm. Mark's chest rose and fell rapidly. The sounds below, grotesque chewing, bones snapping, and inhuman snarls, were unbearable. Their neighbors. The Hendersons. The monsters were feeding. Then came another sound. A shuffling upstairs. Lily's breath hitched. "Daddy," she whispered. Mark motioned for silence. But inside, his mind raced. Upstairs? That meant one thing. They weren't alone. A sudden, heavy thump from the hallway made Sarah clutch Danny tighter. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, unsteady. Mark clenched the bat, inching toward the door. He reached for the knob. Lily's eyes widened. She shook her head frantically. Mark hesitated. But the footsteps grew closer. One step at a time. Then, a growl. Mark wrenched the door open. Standing in the dimly lit hall was Mrs. Henderson. Or what was left of her. Her nightgown was drenched in blood, a chunk of her shoulder missing. Her head twitched unnaturally, her milky white eyes rolling toward Mark. Then, her mouth stretched into a wide, gaping smile, her teeth stained red. She lunged. Mark swung. Crack! The bat connected with her skull, sending her staggering into the wall. She let out a screech, more animal than human. Then, more footsteps. From the stairs. Mark's stomach dropped. The ones from outside had heard the noise. A chorus of guttural moans erupted from downstairs. Lily clamped her hands over her ears, tears spilling down her face. "Mark!" Sarah hissed. Mrs. Henderson recovered quickly, her body jerking unnaturally as she stumbled toward him again. Mark raised the bat for another swing. Bang! A loud gunshot rang through the house. Mrs. Henderson's head snapped backward as a bullet tore through her skull. She collapsed instantly, the sickening sound of her body hitting the floor making Lily gag. Mark spun around. A man stood at the top of the stairs, gun smoking. "You need to move. Now." It was Jake Dawson, their next-door neighbor. A burly man with a scruffy beard, dressed in a blood-stained flannel. His face was drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with adrenaline. Downstairs, the snarls grew louder. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her toward the stairwell. Jake nodded toward the master bedroom window. "We go out that way. Roof connects to my house." Sarah paled. Danny, he can't climb. Jake didn't let her finish. He grabbed Danny and threw him over his shoulder. No choice. Another gunshot rang out. Then another. More figures swarmed the staircase. They ran. Jake kicked open the window, sending glass shards flying. Cold night air rushed in. Sarah went first, slipping onto the roof. Mark helped Lily next. Jake handed Danny over carefully before turning back to fire another shot. Then he climbed out, slamming the window shut behind them. From above, they could see the streets below. Fire. Screaming. Blood. Zombies swarmed the neighborhood like insects, smashing into homes, ripping through doors. There was no safe place left. Mark looked at Jake. Where do we go? Jake's face was grim. We get off these rooftops. Then we run. Sarah gripped Danny, glancing down at the growing horde beneath them. There was nowhere left to hide. Mark's breath came in sharp gasps as he balanced on the slanted rooftop, gripping Lily's hand tightly. The wind howled through the night, carrying the sounds of the chaos below, screams, guttural moans, and the sickening crunch of bones snapping. Jake moved swiftly across the rooftop, leading them toward his house. His boots scraped against the shingles as he crouched near a small attic window. He yanked it open. Go! Sarah hesitated, gripping Danny tightly. Jake grabbed her arm. We don't have time. Move! Sarah slid inside first, Danny clinging to her. Lily followed, her small frame slipping through with ease. Mark pushed her forward, his heart hammering. As he climbed in, the sound of breaking glass from their house made him freeze. The zombies were inside. One of them let out an ear-piercing shriek. Jake shoved Mark in and slammed the attic window shut just as a grotesque figure scrambled onto the roof behind them, its claw-like fingers grasping at the air where they had been seconds ago. Inside the attic, it was pitch black, the air thick with dust. Mark could barely see Sarah holding Danny in the corner, the boy's tiny whimpers muffled against her chest. Lily sat beside them, hugging her knees. Jake turned on a flashlight, keeping it dim. His house had been ransacked, boxes were overturned, insulation hung from the ceiling like cobwebs. But at least, for now, they were safe. For now. Stay quiet, Jake whispered. He moved to a hatch in the floor and carefully eased it open. The house below was silent. Then, thump, thump. Something moved downstairs. Jake clenched his jaw. We're not alone. Mark swallowed hard. Another survivor? A long, guttural growl answered him. No. Not a survivor. Jake motioned for them to follow, leading them down a narrow set of attic stairs. Mark helped Lily down, then Sarah and Danny. As soon as they reached the hallway, Jake raised his gun. Stay close. Mark's stomach twisted as he followed. The house smelled of rot, and the floor was smeared with dark stains. Picture frames were shattered, furniture overturned. Jake's family was nowhere to be seen. Jake, Mark whispered, where's? Jake shot him a look. Mark didn't ask again. They crept toward the kitchen. A half-eaten meal still sat on the table, the food long spoiled. Danny whimpered softly at the smell. Then, a loud bang came from the living room. Jake spun around, raising his gun. The thing stepped into view. It used to be a man, his neighbor, Greg, perhaps, but now it was a monstrosity. His stomach had been ripped open, his intestines dragging across the floor. One of his eyes was missing, a deep gash splitting his forehead. But worse. It wasn't alone. A second figure shambled in, smaller. A child. A girl. Mark's blood turned to ice. It was Jake's daughter. Jake's whole body tensed, his fingers trembling around the trigger. His daughter's blonde hair was matted with blood, her tiny frame twitching unnaturally. Her mouth was slack, stained red. Jake's lip quivered. No, 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 no. The thing that had been his daughter let out a low snarl. Then she lunged. Jake didn't hesitate. Bang! The gunshot echoed through the house. Mark grabbed Lily and shielded her eyes, but it was too late. She had already seen. Jake staggered back, his gun still raised, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His daughter lay motionless, a bullet hole in her forehead. Sarah sobbed quietly. Danny clung to her, too young to understand, but sensing the horror in the room. Jake turned away, his face stone cold. We keep moving. Mark hesitated. Jake, we keep moving, Jake repeated, his voice hollow. He stepped over the bodies and led them to the back door. Mark's hands trembled as he helped Sarah through, then Lily. Once outside, the night air felt suffocating. The streets were worse than before, dozens of creatures roamed freely now, devouring anything in their path. Fires burned in the distance, and the screams had not stopped. Jake took a deep breath. We head for the school. Mark frowned. The school? Reinforced doors. Plenty of supplies. Jake's voice was flat, distant. It's the only chance we've got. Sarah wiped her face, still shaken, but nodded. Okay. Lily tugged on Mark's sleeve. Her voice was barely a whisper. Daddy, why did he do that? Mark knelt beside her, his heart breaking. He didn't know how to explain. He didn't know how to tell her that, sometimes, the cost of survival was too high. Instead, he whispered, just stay close to me. And then, they ran. The night air was thick with smoke and death. Mark held Lily's hand tightly as they ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah clutched Danny close, her feet barely keeping up. Jake led the way, his gun raised, scanning every shadow for movement. The school was 6 blocks away. 6 blocks of hell. The streets were a battlefield. Bodies, both human and otherwise, littered the pavement. Some were motionless. Others still twitched. The dead roamed freely, dragging their rotting limbs across sidewalks, sniffing the air for fresh prey. They ducked into an alleyway behind a row of abandoned cars, crouching low. Jake peered around the edge of a dumpster, cursing under his breath. What? Mark whispered. Jake's voice was grim. Street ahead is crawling. We go that way, we're done. Sarah swallowed hard. What do we do? Jake scanned the alley, his eyes landing on a nearby fire escape. Up. Mark followed his gaze. You want us to climb? Better than being eaten. Jake didn't wait for an argument. He hoisted himself onto a trash bin and reached for the fire escape ladder. It was rusted, but sturdy. He pulled it down with a loud clang. The noise sent chills down Mark's spine. A low snarl echoed from somewhere close. Lily whimpered. Go, now! Jake hissed. Sarah went first, struggling to climb with Danny in her arms. Mark pushed her up, his hands shaking. Jake fired a shot down the alley. A monstrous shriek erupted. The zombies had heard them. Mark scrambled up the ladder behind Sarah, nearly slipping as the rusted metal groaned under his weight. Jake came last, pulling up the ladder just as a group of decayed figures burst into the alley below. They clawed at the brick walls, snarling, teeth snapping at the air. Danny whimpered. Sarah hushed him. Move, Jake urged. Rooftops will get us closer. They climbed higher, reaching the roof of an old apartment complex. The city stretched before them, illuminated by fire and chaos. The school was visible in the distance. Almost there, Mark breathed. But then, a scream. Not a zombie. A person. A woman on the rooftop across from them, waving frantically. Please. Help me, she cried. She stood near the edge, trapped between the ledge and a pair of shambling monsters. Jake's jaw tightened. We can't. Sarah's eyes widened. Jake, we have to do something. We can't save everyone. His voice was steel. The woman sobbed. Please. The creatures lunged. Her screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks as they dragged her down, tearing into her flesh. Lily buried her face in Mark's shirt. Sarah was shaking. We could've. Jake cut her off. No. We couldn't. He turned, moving fast. Keep going. Mark hesitated, glancing at the fresh pool of blood staining the rooftop across from them. Then he followed. 1 block away. They climbed down from the rooftops, moving silently through a burned-out convenience store. The school was just ahead. Jake peeked through the shattered glass door. Looks clear. Mark's hands tightened around the bat. He didn't believe in clear anymore. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. The school gates loomed before them, tall and locked. Jake grunted. We need another way in. Mark scanned the area. The gym doors. I used to pick Lily up from practice. There's an entrance around the back. Jake nodded. Lead the way. They crept along the fence line. Danny whimpered. Mommy, I'm scared. Sarah stroked his hair. Shoo, baby. We're almost safe. Then. A low, wet growl from behind them. Mark's blood ran cold. He turned. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Not just any figure. Mr. Lawson. Lily's school principal. His head twitched violently, his neck at an unnatural angle. Blood dripped from his lips. His fingers were bent at odd angles, as if they'd been broken but still worked. His white, soulless eyes locked onto them. Then, he screamed. Not a human scream. A warning. From the darkness, dozens of figures stirred. Then they charged. Jake fired. Mark grabbed Lily and ran. Sarah screamed as she stumbled, Danny slipping from her arms. Mark turned in time to see a pair of hands reach for his son. No! He swung the bat with every ounce of strength he had. Crack! The creature's skull caved in, black blood spraying across the pavement. Mark yanked Danny up, shoving him back into Sarah's arms. Jake shouted, "The doors!" They ran. The horde was right behind them, snarling, clawing at the ground. Mark reached the gym entrance first. He yanked at the handle. Locked. Jake slammed his shoulder against it. Find another way in. Sarah spotted a shattered window. There. Mark didn't hesitate. He helped Lily and Danny through first, then Sarah. Jake fired again, click. Out of bullets. Go! Jake shoved Mark toward the window as the creatures closed in. Mark scrambled through. Jake! Jake was right behind him. But one of the creatures grabbed his leg. Jake fell hard. Mark lunged, grabbing his arm, but the dead swarmed. Jake's face twisted. Go! Now! Mark's grip tightened. I won't leave you. Jake's expression softened. Then, he shoved Mark back, hard. The last thing Mark saw was Jake disappearing beneath a sea of hands, teeth, and blood. Mark hit the ground inside, the door slamming shut behind him. Sarah was sobbing. Danny was screaming. Lily clung to her father. Mark's hands shook violently. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might explode. Jake was gone. And they were still not safe. Mark sat against the cold tile floor, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His hands were still shaking, blood splattered across his knuckles, Jake's blood. He couldn't stop seeing it. The way Jake had looked at him in those final moments. The way the dead had ripped him away. Dad? Lily's small voice pulled him from the memory. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. Lily's eyes were wide, filled with terror, but she was alive. Danny whimpered in Sarah's arms. Where's Mr. Jake? Sarah's face crumpled, and she pulled Danny closer. Mark looked away. He couldn't say it. couldn't admit it. Not yet. Instead, he pushed himself to his feet and surveyed their surroundings. The gym was eerily quiet. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the shattered window they'd climbed through. Wooden bleachers lined the walls, and a scoreboard hung above the basketball court, frozen in time. Sarah wiped her face. "We can't stay here." Mark nodded. "We need to find supplies. Water. Food. Weapons, anything." Sarah glanced toward the double doors leading into the main school. There might be a storage closet or cafeteria. Mark didn't like the idea of splitting up, but they had no choice. "You and the kids stay here. I'll check the hall." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but one look at his face made her stop. He couldn't lose anyone else. She nodded. "Be careful." Mark gripped the metal bat tighter and approached the doors. The hallway beyond was dark. A flickering emergency light barely illuminated the abandoned lockers and scattered papers. The school smelled of rot. It had been attacked. Dried blood streaked the walls. Broken glass crunched under his feet. But no movement. No sounds. Not yet. He moved cautiously, checking each classroom he passed. Some were ransacked, chairs overturned, desks splintered. Others were eerily untouched, textbooks still open, backpacks forgotten. Then, in the dim light, something moved. Mark froze. A figure stood at the end of the hall, half hidden in shadow. For one terrifying second, he thought it was another monster. But then he saw the gun. A rifle, raised, aimed directly at him. "Who the hell are you?" a voice demanded. Mark's grip on the bat tightened. "I'm just looking for a safe place for my daughter." A tense silence. Then the figure stepped forward. A man. Late 30s. Wild eyes. Dirty clothes. But alive. He didn't lower the gun. "You alone?" Mark hesitated. "No. My friend and our kids are in the gym." The man's gaze flicked past him, toward the doors. Then he nodded. "There are others. You should come with me." Mark's stomach twisted. Trust was dangerous now. But so was being alone. Still, he couldn't risk bringing this stranger near Lily and the others. Mark shook his head. "We're fine on our own." The man's eyes darkened. "No one's fine anymore." Before Mark could respond, a horrific shriek echoed through the halls. The stranger tensed. Shit. It came from somewhere deep in the school. Then another. And another. Mark's blood ran cold. The dead were inside. "We have to move," the man said. "Now." Mark ran. Back in the gym. Sarah jumped at the sound of footsteps. She clutched Danny to her chest, her breath coming fast. "Mark?" The doors burst open. Mark rushed inside, followed by the armed stranger. Lily's eyes widened. "Daddy? Pack what you can. We have to leave. Now." Sarah's face paled. "Why?" A blood-curdling scream answered her. Then, pounding on the doors. Sarah scrambled back, gripping Danny. Lily clung to Mark's leg. The stranger cursed, raising his rifle. Too late. The doors exploded inward. A wave of rotting bodies poured through. Mark grabbed Lily, yanking her behind the bleachers. Sarah ran, dragging Danny with her. The stranger fired. 1, 2, 3 shots. Zombies dropped, but more kept coming. The smell of death and gunpowder filled the air. Mark swung his bat. Crack! A skull split open, black blood spraying his face. Sarah tripped. A zombie lunged for her. Mark threw himself forward, slamming his bat into the creature's ribs. It stumbled, but didn't fall. Teeth snapped. Claws ripped his arm. Mark screamed. The stranger fired. The zombie's head exploded. Mark fell back, clutching his bleeding arm. Sarah sobbed. "You're hurt. We have to go," the stranger yelled. Danny was screaming. The horde kept coming. There was only one way out. The locker rooms. Mark grabbed Lily's hand, dragging her toward the doors. "Move!" Sarah ran, carrying Danny. The stranger covered them, firing, reloading, firing. They burst into the locker room. Mark slammed the door shut. Bang! 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 The zombies pounded against it, the wood splintering. "Find another way out!" Mark shouted. Sarah spotted an air vent above the lockers. "Up there!" Mark boosted Lily up first. Then Danny. Then Sarah. The stranger climbed in after them. Mark was last. The door shattered. They came screaming through. Mark pulled himself into the vent just as rotting fingers grasped at his shoe. Sarah yanked him up. The vent collapsed behind them. Then, silence. The group crawled through the darkness, their breathing ragged. They had survived. For now. But nowhere was safe. To be continued. The air vent was suffocatingly tight. Mark's muscles burned as he crawled forward, dragging his wounded arm through the dust and grime. His breath came in harsh gasps. Every movement sent jolts of pain through his body, but he clenched his teeth and kept going. Behind him, Sarah whispered urgently. "Danny, keep quiet, baby." Danny whimpered but buried his face in her chest, obeying. The metal shaft creaked beneath their weight. Up ahead, the stranger, who still hadn't given his name, halted. "Hold up." Mark froze. The man peered through a vent grate below them. "We're over a classroom." "Empty." Mark exhaled. "Good. We can't stay in this damn vent forever." The stranger kicked the grate open and dropped down first, rifle raised. After scanning the room, he gave a nod. Mark lowered Lily down, then followed. Sarah and Danny came last. The classroom smelled like old books and stale air. Desks were scattered, some overturned. A whiteboard still had a half-finished math problem scrawled across it, like the world hadn't ended here. But the blood smeared across the teacher's desk said otherwise. Sarah turned to the stranger. "Who are you?" He checked his rifle's ammo. "Ethan." Mark wiped sweat from his forehead. "You with other survivors?" Ethan hesitated. Then nodded. "Yeah. Small group. We're holed up in the cafeteria." Sarah's eyes lit with hope. "More people?" Ethan sighed. "Yeah. But don't get too excited. We've lost a lot. And food is running out." A sharp thud against the door made them all tense. Then another. A long, wet scraping noise. Mark's grip tightened on his bat. "They're outside." Ethan moved to the window, peeking out. His face paled. Not just them. Mark joined him, and his stomach dropped. A horde. Hundreds of undead swarmed the courtyard, pressing against the school's outer fences. The thin metal barrier wouldn't hold forever. Sarah gasped. "We need to get to your people. Now." Ethan nodded. "Cafeteria's 2 halls down. We move fast and quiet." Mark knelt in front of Lily. "Stay close, baby girl. No matter what." She nodded, clinging to his hand. Ethan cracked the door open. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lights, casting eerie shadows across the lockers. Clear. For now. They slipped out, moving quickly. Every step echoed. Danny whimpered, but Sarah hushed him. Mark's heart pounded. They turned a corner. A zombie lurched from an open doorway. Ethan fired, too loud. The shot exploded through the silence. The zombie dropped, but the noise had done the damage. From every direction, snarls. Shadows moved. Then, they charged. "Run!" Ethan shouted. Mark scooped Lily up and sprinted. Sarah carried Danny, her breath ragged. Ethan covered them, firing shot after shot. Empty casings clattered to the floor. The cafeteria doors were so close. Then, Danny screamed. Sarah stumbled. Mark turned, just in time to see a rotting hand grab Danny's ankle. Sarah fought. She kicked, clawed, screaming for her son. Mark didn't think, he swung his bat hard. Crack! The zombie's skull shattered. Mark grabbed Danny, shoving him back into Sarah's arms. Go! They burst through the cafeteria doors. Straight into barrels of guns. A group of survivors had weapons trained on them. A woman in a blood-stained hoodie, their leader, stepped forward. You just led the whole damn horde to our doorstep, she growled. Then, bang. The school's front fence collapsed. The dead poured in. The cafeteria filled with screams. And the doors behind them shattered. The cafeteria erupted in chaos. The leader, a sharp-eyed woman with a streak of blood across her cheek, cursed and turned to her group. Barricade the damn doors. Survivors scrambled, dragging tables and chairs, stacking them high. Mark clutched Lily tightly, his pulse thundering. Sarah held Danny close, both of them trembling. Outside, the school's fence had fallen. The dead were pouring in. Ethan gritted his teeth. We don't have much time. The leader whirled on them. Who the hell are you? No time for introductions. Ethan barked. We either fight or we die. The pounding at the doors grew harder. Mark saw cracks forming in the wooden panels. Sarah's voice shook. What do we do? The leader, who Mark now recognized as a fighter, not just a survivor, exhaled sharply. Name's Tanya. We've been holding out here for days, but that fence was the last thing keeping us safe. She turned to her people. We need to fall back to the kitchen. Reinforce the doors. Hold as long as we can. Mark saw it in her eyes, she didn't believe they would hold. A cold dread settled in his stomach. The doors shattered. A wave of rock crashed through. Tanya opened fire, her rifle flashing in the dim cafeteria. Ethan fired beside her, bullets slamming into skulls. Mark swung his bat with everything he had. Crack! A zombie fell, but two more took its place. Screams filled the air. One of Tanya's people, a young man, was dragged down. Tanya didn't hesitate. She fired. Not at the zombies, at him. Mark flinched. Ethan shoved him. Move! They retreated, fighting through the chaos. Mark's breath burned in his lungs. Lily clung to him, her sobs muffled in his shoulder. Sarah was just ahead, Danny in her arms. Tanya and her remaining people backed into the kitchen. One of them, a burly man, slammed the door shut. Lock it! They bolted it just in time. The undead slammed into the other side, their fists pounding like thunder. Danny sobbed. I want to go home. Sarah swallowed hard. I know, baby. I know. Mark looked around. The kitchen was a dead end. Tanya wiped sweat from her forehead. We're trapped. Ethan growled. Not yet. There's gotta be another way out. One of Tanya's men, a wiry guy with glasses, spoke up. The loading dock. It leads outside. Mark's gut twisted. That's where the horde is. Got a better idea? Tanya snapped. The door splintered. Time was up. Tanya turned to her people. We make a break for the dock. Anyone who falls behind, her jaw clenched. You know what to do. Ethan nodded grimly. Let's go. The group rushed through the kitchen, weaving past stoves and prep tables. Danny whimpered, clinging to Sarah. Mark grabbed Lily's hand. Stay with me, sweetheart. The loading dock door loomed ahead. Tanya's man yanked it open. And the dead turned. Mark's stomach dropped. Dozens of rotting heads snapped toward them. For one horrible second, silence. Then, they charged. "Run!" Tanya bellowed. The group scattered. Gunfire exploded. Ethan took point, rifle flashing. Head for the buses. Beyond the loading dock was the school's parking lot, half a dozen abandoned school buses. Hope flickered in Mark's chest. A way out. Sarah sprinted toward the nearest one, Danny in her arms. "Come on." Mark lifted Lily, running as fast as he could. Behind him, screams. Tanya's people were falling. Tanya herself fought like a demon, her machete splitting skulls. But there were too many. Mark reached the bus. "Open it." Sarah yanked the doors. "It's locked." Ethan fired, shattering the driver's window. "Get in." Mark shoved Lily inside. Then Danny. Then Sarah. Tanya was still fighting. Mark turned. "Come on." Tanya was surrounded. She locked eyes with him. Then, a scream. The zombies dragged her down. Mark lunged forward. Ethan grabbed him. "She's gone. We have to go." Tanya's final scream ripped through the night. The dead swarmed her. Mark clenched his jaw, shoving himself into the bus. Ethan climbed in last. He scrambled into the driver's seat, fumbling with the wires. "Come on, come on." The zombies closed in. Mark gripped his bat. "They're coming." The engine roared to life. Ethan slammed the gas. The bus lurched forward, smashing through the horde. Bodies crunched under the wheels. Sarah sobbed, clutching Danny. Mark pulled Lily into his arms, heart hammering. They had escaped. For now. The bus sped down the road, leaving the burning school behind. Mark exhaled. Then, Ethan spoke. "We're not safe yet." Mark followed his gaze. And his stomach dropped. Up ahead. A blockade. Men in tactical gear. Guns raised. And a sign. "No one leaves this town alive." The bus screeched to a halt. Mark's heart pounded as he took in the blockade ahead, men in tactical gear, rifles aimed, bodies lined up on the ground. Not zombies. People. A large metal sign loomed over the road, its spray-painted message dripping like blood. "No one leaves this town alive." Sarah clutched Danny tighter. "Oh God." Ethan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "This isn't good." The soldiers stepped forward, their leader, a hard-eyed man with a scar down his cheek, raising a megaphone. "Step out of the vehicle," his voice boomed. Slowly. Mark exchanged a look with Ethan. "Do we trust them?" Ethan's jaw clenched. Not a damn chance. The undead swarmed behind them, filling the road in a sea of decay. They were trapped. The leader spoke again. "This is your only warning. Exit the vehicle, or be executed." Mark's stomach twisted. These weren't rescuers. They were butchers. Sarah's voice shook. "We can't go back. We can't go forward. What do we do?" Ethan's eyes darted, scanning the scene. "There." He pointed to a narrow forest path off to the side. "We take the bus through." Mark hesitated. "It's too tight. We'll get stuck." Ethan's eyes hardened. "Better than getting shot." The blockade leader lifted his rifle. "You have 3 seconds." Ethan gunned the engine. The bus lurched, tires screeching as it veered toward the path. "Fire," the leader shouted. Gunshots ripped through the air. The windshield shattered. Mark threw himself over Lily, shielding her as bullets tore through the metal. Sarah screamed. The bus slammed through the tree line, branches whipping against the windows. Ethan gritted his teeth, wrestling the wheel as the bus bounced over uneven ground. More gunfire. Then, a loud pop. Mark's gut sank. Tires gone. The bus tilted, metal groaning. Then, crash. The world spun as the bus slid sideways, slamming into a tree. Silence. Then, moaning. The dead were coming. Mark forced himself up. His ears rang, his vision swam. Lily, he gasped. A small whimper. Daddy. She was okay. Sarah groaned, pulling Danny close. We have to move. Ethan was already at the emergency exit, kicking it open. Their men will be here soon, he said. We have to lose them in the woods. Mark grabbed Lily and jumped down. Sarah followed, Danny clinging to her. Ethan reloaded his rifle, his jaw tight. We run. No stopping. The forest was thick, the trees blotting out the moonlight. The only sounds, their ragged breaths, the distant gunfire, and the endless moans behind them. They ran. Twigs snapped beneath their feet. Danny whimpered, but Sarah hushed him. Mark's legs burned, but he kept moving. A single thought pounded in his skull, keep Lily safe. Then, voices. Up ahead, flashlights bobbed through the trees. Search the wreck, a man ordered. Find the survivors. Mark pulled Sarah behind a fallen log. Ethan crouched beside them. Stay quiet, he mouthed. Boots crunched nearby. Mark's grip on Lily tightened. Danny gave a small, muffled whimper. The nearest soldier froze. A beat of silence. Then, over here, he shouted. Gunfire exploded. Ethan fired back, dropping one soldier. Mark grabbed Lily's hand and ran. Sarah was right behind, clutching Danny. The forest erupted into a firefight. A bullet whizzed past Mark's ear. Ethan turned, covering them. A shot slammed into his shoulder. He staggered. Mark caught him before he fell. Come on. Ethan gritted his teeth, pushing forward. Keep going. The woods thinned. Up ahead. A river. Rushing, dark, and cold. Mark's heart pounded. We can't cross that. Sarah gasped. The soldiers' voices closed in. Ethan clutched his bleeding shoulder. We don't have a choice. Mark turned to Sarah. Hold Danny tight. She nodded, fear in her eyes. Mark lifted Lily. Hold your breath, sweetheart. She sniffled, but nodded. The soldiers burst through the trees. Stop, one barked. Mark jumped. Cold swallowed him whole. Lily's arms tightened around his neck. The current dragged them under. Through the chaos, Mark glimpsed Sarah, clutching Danny, fighting the water. Ethan struggled beside them, his wounded arm useless. The river tore them apart. Mark's lungs burned. His grip on Lily slipped. No. He wouldn't lose her. With the last of his strength, he kicked upward. They broke the surface. Gasping. Choking. Alive. The river carried them away, far from the soldiers, far from the town. Mark clutched Lily close, fighting to stay afloat. He barely registered the trees blurring past. The sound of gunfire fading. Just one thought filled his mind. They were free. For now. Epilogue, a new dawn. Days later, Mark awoke on a riverbank, Lily curled against him. Sarah lay nearby, cradling Danny. Ethan sat against a tree, his arm bandaged, his rifle across his lap. Beyond them, a new horizon. The undead were still out there. The soldiers were still hunting. But for the first time since the nightmare began, they had a chance. Mark exhaled, staring at the rising sun. They had survived. And they would keep fighting. Together. The end.